Hey there. So I want to share a 10-minute game that I just played with you against another 1300 rated player. My rating has slipped recently, and it features rather a neat sacrifice. So I'll just take you through the game. It's going to be a quick one, and I decide to use a different opening. So when white plays d4, I play e5, which is the Englund Gambit. White refuses the gambit. In fact, immediately in 0.1 second played c4. So I bring out my knight, and white attacks the knight. I counterattack with check, which means that either the queen, which isn't going to happen, or the bishop or the knight is going to have to interpose, because the king doesn't have any squares to go to. As it happens, it's the knight that gets in the way. And I do have an option here of capturing the knight and forcing white to recapture with the pawn, thereby doubling the pawns here. But instead I advance my knight out of trouble, and white now plays e4. So white's got this quite advanced little pawn structure there, little triangle. I play d6 just to solidify the position and to open up the diagonal for my light square bishop. White now plays his knight out to f3, and I decide that maybe this is a threat. You know, knight takes, and if I recapture, then queen takes, and I'm down a pawn. And then I've also got trouble in this corner here. But I don't have to respond to that straight away, because another alternative is to pin the knight. So the knight is now pinned against the queen and cannot capture my knight. So white brings out another piece into the attack. And now what I notice is that I've got two opportunities to double white's pawns and to make it very difficult for white to get his king to safety. So I start by capturing the knight on c3, white recaptures with the pawn, then I capture with my knight on f3, and the queen can't recapture because the bishop's there. So again, white is forced to capture with a bishop. So now white's got this funny pawn structure in the middle of the board and two isolated pawns on the edges. And my bishop's under attack, so I just drop it back, because I don't want this pawn to advance and undouble itself by either capturing my e5 pawn or me capturing it. So white now blocks the pinned pawn, blocks the pin on the pawn, so the pawn can now move. I bring out my knight, and white brings out his rook on g1 to challenge my undefended pawn on g7. And I decide that because white's position is a bit precarious, there are big holes in his position, that the best thing to do is to solidify. So putting my bishop here is a nice little move. It really negates any danger from this rook. White now moves his queen forward to d2, preparing to castle possibly queenside, which is interesting. So I also bring now my rook across to g8, and white indeed castles queenside. And now this is the sacrifice. Okay, so look at the board. White has this very solid looking pawn structure in the middle of the board, and you notice that all those pawns are on light coloured squares. What that means is that my light squared bishop has very little future in this game. There's a pawn there. How's my bishop going to get through and do anything? So I figure that actually capturing with the bishop, pawn recaptures, knight recaptures, attacking the queen, could have some interesting possibilities. So I capture and sacrifice my bishop, grabbing a pawn. White indeed recaptures, so undoubling his pawns on the f-file, but I now recapture with my knight. And now if you notice, if you count the pawn islands, 1, 2, and then 2 isolated pawns as well. Whereas I've still got all my pawns here, and they're in a very neat, compact structure. Okay, so queen's under attack, and the queen decides to move back to e2. One other options could have been, for example, to move there to defend this pawn, or to move back to e1, also defending the pawn, because that's critical. So this is actually a fork. So white moves back to e1. I push my queen forward with ideas now of coming into this quite open queen side. Maybe attack this pawn, maybe attack this pawn. And I'm thinking if I can get my queen maybe from a4 to a3 with check, the queen's also looking at this pawn, as is the knight. So let's see how it all works out. So the knight is threatened and I move back. Now this pawn is now doing a good job of keeping my knight out of the game, because my knight can't come here, and right now it can't come here either. It can't go there. So this knight's not in a very good position right now. White now makes an error and pushes that good f3 pawn to f4. Yes, it's attacking my e pawn, but that's not a huge concern for me. So I go in with my queen. Now that this knight actually can go back to this outpost square on e4, the queen comes there to defend this pawn. But now I can go back in and renew my attack on the queen. It's the same position. We've just moved backwards and forwards. And white's let me in by pushing that f-pawn. So the queen comes across, attacking my queen, which is undefended. But now I realise that I can go ahead with my plan. Queen to a3, check. So moving the queen to b2 I don't think is really an option, because I can then capture... No, it is. Because if queen to e2, moving the knight there doesn't defend my queen. But white actually moves the king across to b1, and things now start to fall apart. So I capture the pawn with check, forking the king and the rook. The king moves away and I grab the rook. Now what White had some options here, but you see this bishop is now undefended. White actually captures with the rook, and I capture the bishop now. And white pushes f5 and then promptly resigns, because the position is pretty hopeless. If you look at his pawns, so he's down pretty much a rook, because I've got two rooks, but I still have all my pawns on the board. And it's all going to go wrong now for white at this point, so he resigned the game. So sometimes, you know, if you're going to sacrifice a piece, do it for strategic reasons, do it for positional reasons. And for me in this game, sacrificing my bishop for two pawns in order to get that initiative to break up white's structure and start to create these massive holes in the middle of the board, I think was a good move. So I just thought I wanted to share that with you. Nice fun little game. I'll see you next time.